Well, there have been significant developments in Ukraine over the last few days, with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky saying that Russian forces have killed hundreds of civilians as they've left parts of his country. There have been consistent reports that many civilians were killed. Some had their hands tied behind their backs and were blindfolded. Russia's denied the claim, saying this is a staged genocide. At the same time, it appears that Russia is changing its strategy and moving from focusing on the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, to other places of parts of Ukraine. Well, Professor Robert Schrire has been watching this very closely. He's an emeritus professor of politics at UCT. Professor, good afternoon to you. It seems that Russia is changing its strategy. It's no longer concentrating on the area around Kiev, now moving to other areas. How do you assess what Russia's strategy seems to be at this moment?
I think what has become quite clear is that everything is being directed from the center, which means there is a disjunction between what is happening on the ground and what is happening in Moscow. And we can see it very clearly that there is a kind of almost robotic approach to the conflict. Clearly, there was never any plan B, C, or D. The hope, the expectation, they would move in, greeted with flowers and flags, and that would be the end of the story. Now they have found that taking Kyiv almost impossible, and so they are in a way perhaps doing what rational observers thought they would do in the first place. In other words, the only way in which Russian intervention made sense was as a relatively low-cost military intervention in the southeast part of Ukraine. In other words, Donbass, which historically had closer ties to Russia and which had a lot of Russian speakers, and therefore the two mini-states of Donbass would expand and Russia could then at least swallow up quite a big part of Ukraine. And it seems that with the failure of the overall strategy, complete failure, surprised by Ukraine's counterattacks, they are perhaps going back to a downscaled attack on Crimea area with the intention of incorporating it into the Ukraine. But it has to be said with Putin, and one of the things I've been doing in my so-called spare time is to go back and look at what all the experts have said in the last 6 months. And almost all of them have been wrong on almost every point. So we have to be doubly cautious, but it would appear that if Putin is rational, he will downgrade the whole exercise. He will seek to perhaps annex or create puppet states in the Donbass, increase the territory under its control, claim victory, and essentially de-escalate. But that assumes a rational Putin who would be prepared to accept that he will be widely regarded as the loser.
So the West is going to say that this is then a retreat, that this is a defeat. I can just imagine the propaganda war about that. Is it?
I think what we're going to see is that Putin is not going to let Ukraine escape that quickly. If he does go to restrict himself to Donbass, I think what we will see is that he will continue to bomb into rubble large parts of Ukraine. So I think at this stage, Putin, very emotional, will probably continue to attack cities, continue to turn Ukraine into rubble, walk off with Donbass and claim a huge victory.
The reports that Russian forces have killed civilians, and I mean the number I think is going to be disputed for some time, but even the Secretary General of the United Nations has spoken about it. Do you believe those reports? Again, I keep making the point about the propaganda war. Russia's denials are very strong denials. Now look, a lot of people will say, well, Russia denied it was going to invade Ukraine and then it did. But how do you assess these reports that we're seeing now?
I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming. In a more general sense, war always brings out the worst in people. I think in every war there are always human massacres, human abdication of human rights, abuses. I think one can just imagine the stress, the dislocation, that in a sense people in a war situation become vicious. But I think that without being too stereotypical, Russia has a long history of brutality. And I think to some extent the conscripts at the ground, frightened, not probably terribly well educated, being part of a brutal attack would certainly pick up some of that brutality. So I'm quite sure when the absolute story is told, there will be abusers on both sides. And already I think we can see that, understandably, people, emotional, are brutal. But I think that the level of brutality of the Russians will certainly exceed anything from the Ukrainians.
There are a lot of countries that have governments that say they're neutral, or they claim to be neutral. They don't really have a view on whether Russia's invasion is wrong or not. In a sense, our government is one of those. Does this kind of brutality, murder, whatever it is, of what are presumed to be civilians, is this going to put pressure on people to make a decision one way or another? Could it force people off the fence?
I think what is interesting, Stephen, and this is almost the first 21st century war, is that in the past, wars were essentially waged by governments and their agents. So you essentially had the military bureaucracies of different countries fighting with each other. Now, and this is quite unique, we have, if you will, a total war. And by total war, I don't mean all the countries of the world, but I mean this war is waged on all levels: governments, business, social media. And the end result is that it becomes very difficult for governments to control the dialogue. And we've seen already, in fact, that with very few exceptions, public opinion is putting pressure on governments to increase support for the Ukraine. A warning note might be that when those publics in the United States and Western Europe begin to pay a price, and there will be a price, more inflation, scarcity, general dislocation, that they may start putting pressure on governments to de-escalate Ukraine. But certainly at the moment, it becomes a huge number of things, social media, and the result is going to be that public opinion is going to become more important in the short term. The one exception, and it's important perhaps to stress, is that it does seem that Putin has been remarkably successful in controlling public opinion in Russia. And all the opinion polls we've seen from relatively reliable sources indicate that 80% of the Russian population support Putin's explanation that Russia is under attack by enemies who seek to destroy it, and they're rallying round Putin's flag.
That's a really important figure, 80%. But those are not the people who make the decisions. The people who make the decisions in Russia are Putin and the elite around him. The financial elite surely will be suffering. Do they have any influence in Russia at all now, or have the military is the military wing of the elite, if I can call it that, in the ascendancy?
Well, I think very clearly that sanctions and economic dislocation are longer-term results of policy. In other words, it doesn't happen in 24 hours. And, of course, the Russian people are going to suffer. But I think rather sadly the Russian people are historically used to, resigned to suffering from a lack of material goods. We know that the elite, the oligarchs, will certainly not suffer. They will always find ways of taking care of themselves. And a perfect example is, of course, Kim in North Korea. Despite all the blockades, the boycotts, the sanctions, we know that Mr. Kim enjoys the best of cognac, the best cars, the best of modern consumer goods. So the elite in Russia will continue to enjoy these benefits. But it depends really on whether Putin is able to maintain this myth that the problems of Russia are caused by America. Because if he is able to, then paradoxically, the worse things get for Russian people, the more anti-American, the more pro-Putin they might turn out to be.